The fog that shrouded London on that October evening in 1891 seemed to possess an almost malevolent quality, pressing against the windows of 221B Baker Street with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. Dr. Watson sat beside the crackling fire, his evening paper forgotten in his lap, as he watched his companion pace the length of their sitting room with that restless energy that invariably preceded their most extraordinary cases. Sherlock Holmes paused at the window, his sharp profile illuminated by the gaslight as he observed the street below with characteristic intensity. "Observe, Watson," Holmes remarked without turning, "how our lamplighter tonight deviates from his usual routine. Notice the deliberate pause at each post, the careful examination of each flame. A man whose livelihood depends upon efficiency does not waste precious seconds unless compelled by circumstances beyond the ordinary." Before Watson could respond to this typically astute observation, the urgent clatter of wheels upon cobblestones announced the arrival of a hansom cab, followed immediately by hurried footsteps upon their stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared at their door, her usually composed demeanor betraying traces of excitement. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "And I must say he appears quite agitated. He mentioned something about lights beneath the river, though I'm sure I cannot fathom what he means by such a thing." Lestrade entered their chambers bearing the unmistakable signs of a man who had spent considerable time near the Thames. His coat glistened with moisture, and the distinctive odor of river mud clung to his boots. In his hands he carried a leather satchel and a small glass vial containing what appeared to be dark sediment. "Holmes," Lestrade began without preamble, "we have a case that defies all rational explanation. For 3 consecutive nights, witnesses have reported lanterns burning beneath the waters of the Thames near Blackfriars Bridge. Not floating upon the surface, mind you, but suspended in the depths themselves, glowing with an eerie green light that penetrates the murky water like nothing I have ever witnessed." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest as he gestured for the inspector to continue. "The first night, we dismissed the reports as the fantasies of late-evening revelers," Lestrade continued, settling into the chair Watson indicated. "The second night, we posted constables along both embankments. They confirmed the sightings, 13 lanterns arranged in a precise pattern, moving with purpose along the riverbed. But here is where the matter becomes truly sinister." The inspector opened his satchel and withdrew a waterlogged document. "Last night, we discovered this floating near the bridge, the personal effects of Mr. Aldrich Blackwood, a respected antiquarian who specializes in marine archaeology. His housekeeper reports he left his Bloomsbury residence 3 days ago, claiming he had received an urgent summons regarding a discovery beneath the Thames. He has not been seen since." Watson leaned forward, his medical instincts aroused by the gravity in Lestrade's voice. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect something far more complex than mere foul play, Doctor," Lestrade replied grimly. "Blackwood's study was found locked from within, yet he had vanished completely. The only clue was a cryptic message scrawled upon his desk blotter. The 13th lantern calls. We have consulted the Board of Works regarding the river's infrastructure. According to their records, the culverts and drainage systems beneath that section of the Thames were sealed decades ago during Bazalgette's great engineering project." Holmes had begun his characteristic pacing, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Yet someone clearly has access to these supposedly sealed passages," he murmured. "The lanterns suggest organization, purpose, perhaps even a sophisticated understanding of underwater illumination techniques." "Precisely," Lestrade confirmed. "Lestrade, we attempted to investigate the underwater passages, but our diving equipment proved inadequate for the task. The currents are treacherous, and the visibility virtually non-existent. Whatever forces are at work beneath the Thames, they possess knowledge and resources far beyond ordinary criminal enterprise." The fog pressed more insistently against their windows, and somewhere in the distance, the mournful sound of a ship's horn echoed across the darkened city, as if the Thames itself were calling out in warning. Holmes moved with that characteristic energy Watson recognized as the prelude to intensive investigation, the fog outside seeming to press against their windows with renewed urgency. "Inspector," he began, accepting the vial of sediment and holding it toward the gaslight. "Observe how this material exhibits properties quite distinct from ordinary Thames mud." The detective tilted the container, allowing the contents to catch the flame's illumination, revealing an unmistakable phosphorescent quality that cast eerie shadows across his sharp features. "Watson, your medical training may prove invaluable here," Holmes continued, passing the vial to his companion. "Note the consistency, the unusual luminescence, the deliberate processing this material has clearly undergone. This is not naturally occurring river sediment, but rather something that has been carefully treated with compounds specifically chosen for their light-conducting properties." Watson examined the sample with growing fascination, his scientific curiosity aroused by the specimen's extraordinary characteristics. "Holmes, I have never encountered anything quite like this in my studies. The phosphorescent quality suggests the presence of calcium sulfide, or perhaps zinc sulfide, compounds used in experimental lighting applications, but the texture indicates deliberate mixing with organic materials from the riverbed itself." "Precisely," Holmes declared, his eyes brightening with that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement. "Someone has established sophisticated operations beneath the Thames, and operations requiring not only access to sealed medieval passages, but also considerable knowledge of chemistry and underwater illumination techniques." He turned to Lestrade with renewed intensity. "Inspector, you mentioned that Blackwood specializes in marine archaeology. What specific areas of expertise?" Lestrade consulted his notebook eagerly. According to his colleagues at the Royal Archaeological Society, Blackwood has spent 5 years researching lost medieval infrastructure beneath London. He believed certain monastic foundations extended under the Thames through tunnel networks, predating even Roman settlements. His theories were considered quite radical by academic standards. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, beginning his characteristic pacing as the pieces of the puzzle began forming patterns in his analytical mind. Medieval monasteries, underwater passages, and a missing antiquarian who received an urgent summons regarding discoveries beneath the river. The connection grows stronger with each detail. He paused suddenly, his attention drawn to a minute detail on Lestrade's damp coat. "Tell me, Inspector, did you perhaps visit Billingsgate Fish Market this morning before coming to the yard?" Lestrade blinked in astonishment. "Billingsgate? How could you possibly know that? And what relevance could it have to underwater lanterns and missing antiquarians?" Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. The faint yet distinct aroma of freshly gutted cod and a microscopic scale caught in your tweed, just beneath your left lapel. North Sea cod, not Thames fish, indicating a morning purchase before the river mist dispersed. It demonstrates a fundamental principle. Inspector, nothing is irrelevant until proven so. This case exhibits the same attention to seemingly insignificant details elevated to extraordinary significance. The detective moved to his correspondence desk, withdrawing paper and pen with decisive movements. "I am dispatching urgent messages to 3 individuals whose expertise may prove invaluable. Professor Challenger, whose knowledge of subterranean geology is unparalleled. Captain Morrison of the Thames River Police, who possesses intimate knowledge of every legitimate entrance to the river's underground systems. And Mr. Tobias Gregson of the experimental diving equipment manufacturers." As Holmes sealed the envelopes, footsteps echoed from the stairway below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's concerned voice. "Mr. Holmes, there's a young lady here who insists she must speak with you immediately. She claims it concerns the missing gentleman and the lights beneath the river." Holmes and Watson exchanged meaningful glances, while Lestrade straightened with sudden attention. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, arriving just as they had begun unraveling the mystery's initial threads. "Show her up immediately, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called. his voice carrying that note of anticipation Watson had learned to recognize as the herald of significant revelations. The fog continued its relentless assault upon London's streets, but within their warm sitting room, the first connections were crystallizing into a pattern that would soon reveal the extraordinary complexity of the forces at work beneath the Thames. Holmes stood poised at the threshold of discovery, his brilliant mind already racing ahead to possibilities that would challenge everything they thought they understood about the case. The young woman who ascended their stairs possessed that particular bearing Watson had learned to associate with individuals thrust into extraordinary circumstances against their natural inclinations. She entered with measured steps, her dark traveling dress bearing the telltale dampness of London's pervasive fog, while her gloved hands clutched a worn leather portfolio with the desperate grip of one clinging to her final connection to normalcy. Holmes observed her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to catalogue every detail within moments, noting the slight tremor in her fingers, the determined set of her jaw, and the unmistakable intelligence that flickered behind her anxious eyes. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of education tempered by genuine distress. "I am Miss Eleanor Blackwood, niece and research assistant to Aldrich Blackwood. I have come because I fear the conventional investigation will prove inadequate to the extraordinary circumstances surrounding my uncle's disappearance." She paused, gathering her composure as Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "Inspector Lestrade's inquiries at our Bloomsbury residence were thorough, but I believe certain crucial details may have escaped notice." Holmes leaned forward with that characteristic intensity Watson recognized as the prelude to significant revelations. "Miss Blackwood, please share everything you consider relevant. The inspector has provided us with the basic circumstances, but I suspect you possess information that may prove vital to our understanding of this singular case." She settled into the offered chair, her portfolio resting carefully across her lap as she began to speak with growing confidence. "My uncle has been consumed for months by what he termed the lost monastery of St. Dunstan beneath the Thames. He claimed to have discovered medieval manuscripts, suggesting that the monks established a network of underwater chambers and passages extending from Southwark to the city, predating even the Norman conquest. From her portfolio, she withdrew a collection of yellowed parchments and modern sketches, spreading them carefully upon the table between them. Watson examined the documents with growing fascination, noting the meticulous detail with which Blackwood had reconstructed the theoretical layout of the submerged complex. The diagrams suggested remarkable engineering sophistication, with intricate systems of airlocks, drainage channels, and what appeared to be carefully planned illumination points marked at regular intervals throughout the passages. 3 weeks ago," Miss Blackwood continued, "Uncle claimed to have found definitive proof that the monastery's treasury was sealed beneath the river when Henry VIII's commissioners arrived. According to these documents, the monks used underwater lanterns to guide their boats through the submerged passages during high tide. He spent countless hours in his laboratory, experimenting with phosphorescent compounds, attempting to recreate what he believed was their ancient illumination method." Lestrade straightened with sudden interest. "The sediment we found your uncle's experiments?" "Undoubtedly," she confirmed. "But 2 weeks ago, everything changed. A gentleman called at our residence, claiming to represent a private antiquarian society. He was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair and the most unusual eyes, one blue, one green. He spoke with a slight accent, possibly German, and possessed knowledge of medieval hydraulics that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. He offered substantial sums for exclusive access to Uncle's research, particularly what he termed the 13th entrance." Holmes had been studying the documents with characteristic intensity, his long fingers tracing the carefully drawn passages. "Did your uncle mention any specific artifact connected to these passages, Miss Blackwood?" Her expression brightened slightly. "Yes, indeed. He possessed an ancient brass key, heavily corroded, which he believed unlocked some secret within the abbey itself. He called it the key to the deep, and claimed it was mentioned specifically in the medieval texts as essential to accessing the treasury chambers. "And this key, where is it now?" "Gone," she replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Along with Uncle's most precious research notes and the original manuscript fragments. The night before his disappearance, he locked himself in his study for hours, emerging only to tell me that if anything should happen, I must seek out Sherlock Holmes and tell him that the 13th lantern calls, and the key to the deep must not fall into unworthy hands." The fog pressed more insistently against their windows, and somewhere in the distance, the mournful sound of a ship's horn echoed across the darkened city. Holmes rose from his chair with that characteristic energy Watson recognized as the moment when scattered fragments of evidence began crystallizing into coherent patterns within his extraordinary mind. The detective's sharp gaze fixed upon Miss Blackwood with renewed intensity, his voice carrying an urgency that made both Watson and Lestrade lean forward expectantly. This mysterious gentleman with the disparate eyes, did he leave any means of contact or identification beyond his unusual appearance? Miss Blackwood reached into her reticule and produced a small white calling card, its edges slightly worn from handling. He presented this, bearing the name Heinrich Zimmermann and an address in Rotherhithe. Uncle was initially skeptical, but when Herr Zimmermann demonstrated intimate knowledge of medieval hydraulic engineering and quoted passages from manuscripts Uncle believed were unique to his private collection, his resistance crumbled entirely. Holmes accepted the card with evident interest, subjecting it to examination through his magnifying glass. "Watson, observe the paper quality expensive continental stock, but note the slight discoloration along the edges and the faint odor of river dampness. This card has been exposed to considerable moisture, suggesting frequent visits to locations near the Thames. The typography is German, executed by English printers, indicating our Herr Zimmermann maintains sophisticated local connections while preserving his foreign identity. There is something else," Miss Blackwood continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something Uncle made me promise never to reveal unless circumstances became truly desperate. 3 months ago, while researching in the British Museum's restricted collections, he discovered references to what the medieval texts called the abbot's engine, some sort of mechanical device the monks used to control water levels throughout their underground complex. The implications struck Watson immediately, his medical training helping him appreciate the sophisticated engineering required for such a system. Holmes, if such a device actually exists and could be made functional again, someone with knowledge of London's modern infrastructure could potentially manipulate water levels throughout the Thames system. The consequences for the Underground Railway, the sewer networks, even the foundations of Parliament itself could be catastrophic." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes replied grimly, his mind already racing through the strategic implications. Medieval engineering, combined with modern chemistry and underwater illumination techniques, creates possibilities for sabotage that would make conventional explosives seem primitive by comparison. The 13 lanterns aren't merely signals or markers. They represent a systematic exploration of the monastery's defenses, someone methodically testing the ancient systems to understand their full potential. Lestrade paled visibly at the revelation. "Then we must investigate this Rotherhithe address immediately, Holmes. If Blackwood is being held there, or if we can apprehend this Zimmermann character." "Patience, Inspector," Holmes cautioned, already reaching for his Inverness cape. "First, we must examine Blackwood's study with fresh eyes. A man of his intellectual caliber, anticipating treachery, would have left behind more than a cryptic note on a blotter. He would have created a trail, however subtle, for someone who knew where and how to look." The fog seemed to thicken as they prepared to depart. Mrs. Hudson providing Miss Blackwood with a warm shawl against the October chill. Their hansom cab moved through streets transformed into a maze of shifting shadows and gaslight halos, the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones providing a rhythmic counterpoint to Holmes's intense concentration. Watson observed his friend's profile, noting the familiar signs of a mind working at extraordinary speed, processing every detail of the case with methodical precision. The Bloomsbury residence loomed before them through the murk, its Georgian facade bearing the austere dignity of scholarly pursuits, now overshadowed by sinister implications. As they ascended the steps, Holmes paused, his keen eyes detecting something that had escaped previous observation. Note the faint scratches around the door lock. Watson, recent, deliberate, suggesting someone with considerable skill, gained entry without the benefit of keys. Miss Blackwood produced her key with trembling fingers, though Holmes raised a cautioning hand as he knelt to examine the lock mechanism through his magnifying glass. The scratches were indeed recent, executed with precision yet bearing subtle signs of haste that spoke to someone working under considerable time constraints. Whoever gained entry possessed considerable skill but was operating with urgency rather than leisure, he murmured, rising as the door swung open to reveal the darkened interior. The house retained that peculiar atmosphere Watson had learned to associate with scholarly pursuits, suddenly interrupted, as if the very walls held their breath awaiting their owner's return. Gas lamps flickered to life as Miss Blackwood moved through familiar rooms, her footsteps echoing against polished floors, while the scent of camphor and old leather bindings permeated the air. The sitting room bore subtle signs of disturbance, books pulled from shelves and hastily replaced, cushions slightly askew, drawers that failed to close properly despite their owner's naturally meticulous habits. Holmes moved with that characteristic deliberation, Watson recognized as the prelude to significant discoveries, his keen eyes cataloguing details that escaped ordinary observation. In the study itself, papers lay scattered across Persian carpeting, while filing cabinets stood open with contents systematically rifled. Yet beneath the apparent chaos lay an unmistakable pattern of professional search rather than random vandalism. Inspector Bradstreet's men conducted a thorough examination, Lestrade declared, gesturing around the cluttered space. Every document, every book, every loose paper was catalogued. We found nothing beyond what Miss Blackwood reported the missing research, the key, and that cryptic message on the blotter. Holmes, however, approached the great oak desk with renewed interest, kneeling beside scattered papers where something metallic caught the gaslight. He lifted a small brass fitting partially concealed beneath correspondence, its surface bearing the unmistakable patina of considerable age. The mechanism appeared intricate, clearly part of some larger device, with carefully machined components that spoke to sophisticated engineering. Miss Blackwood, have you encountered this before? Holmes inquired, extending the artifact for her examination. Her scholarly training overcame emotional distress as she studied the piece carefully. Yes, indeed. Uncle called it a component of the Abbott's engine, discovered last month embedded in Thames mud near Blackfriars. He found several similar brass pieces that seemed to form some hydraulic mechanism, though he was never entirely certain of their specific functions. And the other components? Gone, along with everything else of value to his research, she replied with bitter resignation. But Uncle was far too experienced to keep everything in one location. He maintained a secondary workshop in the basement, accessible through a concealed entrance he discovered during renovations last spring. Watson observed Holmes's expression sharpen with that intensity he recognized as the moment when disparate clues began forming coherent patterns. But something else had captured the detective's attention, his gaze fixed upon a section of wall behind an ornate globe, apparently unremarkable yet holding his interest with unusual persistence. Holmes approached the globe, rotating it slowly while his fingers traced its surface, then pressed lightly against the wooden paneling behind it. There was no visible change, yet Watson sensed a profound shift in his friend's demeanor. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, and the almost imperceptible tightening around his lips betrayed sudden internal calculation. Whatever he had discovered, he chose to keep it to himself, turning back to continue his examination as if nothing had occurred. "This hidden workshop," Holmes said, addressing Miss Blackwood, while his mind clearly processed multiple possibilities simultaneously. Inspector Bradstreet's team found no basement workshop during their search. She smiled for the first time since entering Baker Street hours earlier. Uncle was quite proud of his discovery. The entrance appears to be merely a wine cellar, but the medieval builders created a false wall opening onto much older chambers. He believed they were part of the original monastic foundation, predating the house by several centuries. Holmes had begun his characteristic pacing, the brass component turning between his long fingers. Then we must examine this workshop immediately. If Blackwood anticipated treachery, he would have concealed his most valuable discoveries in the safest possible location. The fog pressed against windows with renewed intensity, as if London itself awaited what secrets lay hidden in the depths below. Miss Blackwood led them through the narrow rear corridor, past shelves lined with archaeological specimens whose shadows seemed to shift and dance in their lamplight. The wine cellar entrance appeared conventional enough, bearing the expected dampness and vintner's markings of decades past. Yet Holmes examined the threshold with characteristic thoroughness, his magnifying glass revealing subtle scratches in the stone flooring that suggested frequent passage despite the cellar's apparent disuse. The descent into darkness felt like entering another epoch entirely, their gas lamps casting flickering shadows against stone walls that predated the Georgian house above by several centuries. The air grew noticeably cooler and carried that distinctive scent. Watson associated with places where time itself seemed suspended, ancient mortar, undisturbed earth, and something else, a metallic quality that spoke to recent mechanical activity in spaces designed for far different purposes. Miss Blackwood moved with practiced confidence past wine racks toward what appeared to be solid medieval masonry. She pressed against a particular stone, and with the soft grinding of counterweights and hidden mechanisms, a section of wall swung inward to reveal a chamber that exceeded Watson's wildest expectations. The workshop beyond defied every assumption about basement storage, combining medieval architecture with scientific equipment that rivaled the finest laboratories Watson had encountered during his medical training. Workbenches lined the ancient stone walls, bearing brass components, chemical apparatus, and detailed engineering drawings that suggested Blackwood's research had progressed far beyond theoretical speculation into practical application. Gas jets provided steady illumination for intricate work, while glass vessels containing phosphorescent compounds glowed with that eerie green luminescence they had observed in Lestrade's sample. The air carried the distinct odors of brass polish, chemical reagents, and that peculiar camphor scent Holmes had noted earlier. "Watson," Holmes called, his voice carrying that note of discovery. Watson recognized as breakthrough. "Observe this extraordinary mechanism." He stood before a complex brass apparatus, approximately 3 feet in height, its surface bearing the unmistakable patina of considerable age, yet clearly maintained in perfect working condition. The device featured multiple chambers, precision gears, and what appeared to be adjustable valves designed for regulating water flow under tremendous pressure. "The Abbott's engine," Miss Blackwood confirmed with evident reverence. "Uncle spent months restoring it to functional condition. According to his research, the medieval monks used this to control water levels throughout their underground complex, allowing safe navigation regardless of tidal conditions." But Holmes had discovered something that captured his complete attention. Upon the central workbench lay a meticulously detailed chart of the Thames riverbed from Southwark to Blackfriars, upon which 13 points were marked with mathematical precision and connected by dotted lines, forming a pattern that suggested both constellation and mechanism. Each point corresponded to specific depth measurements and current variations, while the 13th bore a distinctive symbol, a cross within a circle. "Not mere signals," Holmes murmured, tracing the connections with his finger, "but calibration points for a systematic exploration of the monastery's defenses." His keen eyes had also detected boot prints near the threshold, their mud dried to grey-green crust. Through his magnifying glass, he observed the sharp impression of a heel plate with an unfamiliar tread pattern. Continental manufacture, German cobbler's work, with mud-bearing mica flakes and petroleum residue consistent with Rotherhithe's industrial waterfront. Lestrade straightened with sudden understanding. Zimmerman has been here. Holmes nodded grimly while examining an open journal whose final entry, dated 3 days prior, contained passages that chilled Watson's blood. Zimmerman's true purpose has become clear. The 13th entrance controls not merely access to treasury chambers, but the Thames itself. He seeks power over London's very lifeblood, and I fear my research has provided him with knowledge that threatens the entire city. The gas flames flickered ominously, as if responding to the gravity of their discovery, while somewhere in the darkness beyond their circle of light, the sound of dripping water carried an almost menacing quality that suggested the ancient systems were already stirring to malevolent life. Holmes closed Blackwood's journal with deliberate care, though Watson observed the subtle tension in his friend's movements that betrayed the urgency of their situation. The detective's sharp eyes had absorbed every detail of the antiquarian's increasingly desperate final entries, and the implications settled upon the underground chamber like a physical weight. "Watson, we are dealing with something far more sophisticated than mere criminal enterprise," Holmes declared, his voice carrying that ominous quality Watson associated with cases that transcended ordinary investigation into matters of national peril. The journal's final passages revealed a progression from scholarly enthusiasm to mounting horror, as Blackwood realized how his research had been systematically exploited. Holmes read aloud from an entry dated merely 2 days before the antiquarian's disappearance. Zimmerman's questions focus not on historical significance, but on practical application. He inquires repeatedly about pressure, tolerances, structural weak points in London's foundations, and the precise locations where medieval passages intersect with modern infrastructure. I fear I have been monumentally naive. Miss Blackwood had grown pale as the true nature of her uncle's predicament became apparent, her scholarly pride giving way to horrified understanding. The brass mechanism before them was not merely an archaeological curiosity, but a weapon capable of devastating London itself. Holmes moved to examine the Thames chart with renewed intensity, his long fingers tracing the connections between the 13 marked points while his analytical mind processed the full scope of Zimmerman's design. "The 13th entrance," Holmes murmured, studying the distinctive symbol marked beneath Blackfriars Bridge, "is not merely another access point, but the master control for the entire hydraulic system. With the Abbott's engine and Blackwood's brass key, someone could manipulate water levels throughout central London, creating floods or droughts at will. The medieval monks designed their defenses to repel Norman invaders, but those same systems could devastate a modern city dependent upon precise engineering tolerances." Watson felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. The underground railway tunnels, the embankment walls, even the Houses of Parliament itself, could be threatened by someone with control over such a system. Lestrade moved closer to examine the chart with growing alarm, his face reflecting the same horrified realization that was dawning upon them all. Holmes had discovered something else that made his expression sharpen with dangerous clarity. Among Blackwood's correspondence lay a letter bearing the letterhead of the German Archaeological Institute, revealing that Zimmermann had been monitoring the antiquarian's research for months through seemingly innocent scholarly exchanges. The systematic nature of the infiltration spoke to intelligence gathering of the highest order, careful cultivation of an unwitting asset, and meticulous preparation for an operation that could hold London itself hostage. The detective straightened suddenly, his keen hearing detecting something that escaped ordinary perception. A faint rhythmic tremor passed through the flagstones beneath their feet, followed by the distant sound of water moving through confined spaces with increasing urgency. The ancient systems were stirring to life, responding to forces beyond their immediate comprehension. "We must investigate the passage beyond this chamber," Holmes declared, moving toward a low archway partially concealed behind shelving. Miss Blackwood directed them through the narrow opening into a vaulted corridor whose stones gleamed with moisture and bore the unmistakable marks of recent passage. Their lamplight revealed chalk symbols, circles, bisected by crosses, marking the walls at regular intervals, some fresh enough to pulse with faint phosphorescent residue. The passage descended toward the sound of running water, and at a stone landing whose steps disappeared into darkness, Holmes's lamp illuminated something that made Watson's blood run cold. A body floated in the black water below, turning slowly until its face emerged with dreadful calm. They drew the corpse to the steps, with a boat hook left against the wall, revealing a workman whose pockets had been systematically emptied and whose cap contained a fragment of oiled paper bearing German script, the remnants of a delivery invoice for Tachlaturnen, 13 Stück, and the smeared imprint of a Rotherhithe chandlery. Holmes examined the dead man's boots with his magnifying glass, noting mud that contained mica flakes and petroleum residue consistent with the industrial waterfront. Continental manufacture, he observed grimly, and evidence that Zimmerman's operations center near Cherry Gardens. Our drowned friend learned too much about the 13 lanterns and paid the ultimate price for his knowledge. Rising with that characteristic energy, Watson recognized as the prelude to decisive action, Holmes began issuing rapid instructions. Lestrade, you must alert Captain Morrison of the Thames River Police immediately. We need men posted along both embankments and diving equipment brought to Blackfriars Bridge. The midnight tide approaches, and if Zimmerman intends to demonstrate his mastery of the engine tonight, he will reveal himself at the 13th point. The sound of water grew more insistent in the darkness beyond their lamplight, and somewhere above them, the fog pressed against London with renewed intensity, as if the very atmosphere sensed the malevolent forces stirring beneath the Thames. Holmes adjusted a valve on the Abbott's engine, listening intently to the subtle change in pressure, then turned to Miss Blackwood with uncharacteristic gentleness. You will remain above with the constable when he arrives, he instructed, pressing a folded paper into her palm. If we fail to return by 2 o'clock, send these notes to Baker Street. We have not lost your uncle yet, but the next few hours will determine whether London itself survives this night intact. Lestrade departed with characteristic determination, his boots echoing against stone as he ascended toward the street to coordinate with Captain Morrison's Thames River Police, while Holmes secured the concealed entrance behind them with methodical precision. The detective's sharp eyes had absorbed every detail of Blackwood's final journal entries, and Watson observed that familiar intensity settling over his friend's features as the full scope of their adversary's design crystallized into deadly clarity. Holmes moved through the narrow passage with that purposeful energy Watson recognized as complete mental focus, their bull's-eye lanterns casting wavering circles of light upon walls that bore centuries of London's hidden history in their damp surfaces. The air grew progressively colder as they descended, carrying the metallic scent of river water, and something else, the distinctive odor of phosphorescent compounds that confirmed Zimmerman's recent presence in these forgotten depths. Watson, Holmes murmured, pausing to examine fresh chalk markings upon the ancient stones. Observe how our German friend has systematically mapped these passages, marking pressure points and structural vulnerabilities with mathematical precision. He has spent weeks preparing for tonight's demonstration, studying every aspect of the medieval hydraulic system until he could manipulate it with the confidence of its original architects. The passage opened into a vaulted chamber where the sound of moving water echoed with increasing urgency, and through iron gratings set into the floor, they glimpsed the Thames flowing past with unnatural turbulence. The 13 lanterns were visible at last, suspended beneath the surface like drowned stars, their phosphorescent glow pulsing in synchronized rhythm that spoke to mechanical control rather than natural phenomenon. Holmes knelt beside an ancient lock mechanism, withdrawing from his waistcoat a brass disc whose edge bore delicate notches. Watson watched with fascination as his friend fitted the device against a concealed recess, explaining in hushed tones, "Blackwood left us patterns, Watson, hidden within his workshop sketches. A man of his intellectual caliber, anticipating treachery, would not rely solely upon the original key, but would create means for allies to follow his trail." The mechanism responded with barely a whisper, revealing a narrow aperture that opened directly onto the river passage where the lanterns maintained their eerie vigil. Through the opening came the sound of muffled voices speaking German, and the creak of oarlocks as a low-slung skiff moved through the phosphorescent glow with deliberate purpose. Holmes extinguished his lantern and motioned Watson to absolute silence as they observed three figures in the boat below. Two men at the oars, and a third crouched beside a metal casket whose contents emitted that familiar green luminescence. The boat moved with practiced efficiency toward a circular chamber whose dome bore the faint remains of medieval frescoes, now devoured by centuries of river dampness. In the chamber's center stood a tall figure whose narrow shoulders and severely brushed hair were illuminated by the lantern's glow, while his distinctive heterochromia, one pale eye, one dark green, identified him unmistakably as their quarry. Zimmerman's gloved hands rested upon a brass mechanism that was clearly the master control for the entire hydraulic system, while beside him lay the corroded key that represented Blackwood's life's work, transformed into an instrument of potential devastation. Noch einmal, bei der Dresenten Laterne, Zimmerman commanded his subordinates, his voice carrying the calm authority of absolute confidence. He raised the ancient key toward the mechanism's central lock, while the astronomical tide approached its peak, creating the precise conditions necessary for his demonstration of power over London's very foundations. Holmes checked his pocket watch with characteristic precision, noting that midnight approached with mathematical inevitability. Somewhere above, Captain Morrison's men would be positioning themselves along both embankments. But the true confrontation would occur here, in the depths where medieval engineering met modern malevolence. The detective stepped forward into the phosphorescent glow, his voice carrying across the water with calm authority that made Zimmerman pause in his preparations. "I would not turn that key, Herr Zimmerman. London has survived the plague, the Great Fire, and Napoleon's ambitions. It will survive your demonstration as well." Zimmerman turned slowly, his mismatched eyes studying Holmes with cool appraisal that suggested calculation rather than surprise. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes," he replied in precise English. "London will indeed learn the value of punctuality tonight, when the Thames itself becomes my instrument of instruction." The ancient stones trembled as mechanical forces stirred to malevolent life in the darkness below. Holmes stepped onto the narrow stone ledge with that characteristic deliberation Watson had witnessed in their most perilous encounters, his voice carrying across the phosphorescent water with the calm authority of absolute conviction. The detective's sharp eyes had already catalogued every detail of the chamber, the positioning of Zimmerman's subordinates, the mechanical connections between the ancient brass controls and the 13 lanterns below, and most crucially, the subtle variations in water pressure that spoke to forces already stirring in the medieval depths. "Your demonstration will indeed prove instructive, Herr Zimmermann," Holmes declared, his words echoing against stones that had witnessed centuries of London's hidden history, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipate. "You see, you have made the fundamental error of assuming that Professor Blackwood worked alone during these crucial final weeks." Zimmerman's mismatched eyes narrowed with the first flicker of uncertainty Watson had observed in their adversary, his gloved fingers tightening around the corroded brass key, while the phosphorescent glow pulsed with increasing urgency around them. The German's voice carried a note of controlled irritation when he replied, "Impossible, Mr. Holmes. Blackwood's research has been under constant observation, and every calculation verified through weeks of meticulous study." "Indeed," Holmes agreed with that maddening composure that invariably preceded his most devastating revelations, which is precisely why certain crucial modifications proved so effective. "Watson, our German friend, failed to consider that a scholar of Blackwood's integrity, discovering the true nature of his visitor's intentions, might seek assistance from someone with complementary expertise in medieval hydraulic engineering." From the shadows of a concealed alcove, a familiar figure emerged into the lantern light, and Watson felt his heart leap with relief as Professor Aldrich Blackwood stepped forward. The antiquarian's scholarly features bore the strain of captivity. Yet his eyes blazed with the intelligence that had clearly been observing and calculating throughout his apparent imprisonment. His voice, though hoarse from confinement, carried the cultured tones of academic authority when he addressed Holmes directly. "My dear Holmes," Blackwood called across the water, "I fear our German friend possesses one advantage you may not have fully anticipated. The Abbot's engine responds not merely to the brass key, but to a precise understanding of what the medieval architects called the 13th warning, a fail-safe mechanism they built into the very heart of their hydraulic system." Holmes's expression sharpened with that intensity Watson recognized as the moment when scattered pieces of evidence crystallized into perfect clarity. "The 13th lantern," he murmured, his gaze fixing upon the distinctive symbol that pulsed with different rhythms than its 12 companions. Not merely a marker or control point, but a pressure release valve disguised within the overall design. Zimmerman's composure, usually so absolute, showed the first signs of genuine concern as he processed this unexpected development. The rhythmic tremor beneath their feet intensified, and the water in the river passage beyond the gratings began to churn with greater vigor as the midnight tide approached its crucial peak. The German's voice carried a note of forced confidence when he declared, "A desperate bluff, Mr. Holmes." Blackwood's notes contained no mention of such a mechanism. Blackwood's published notes, Holmes corrected with deadly calm, but his private journals, the ones you so diligently acquired, contained extensive marginalia concerning his growing understanding of the system's true purpose. The medieval monks, you see, were not merely engineers but philosophers who understood that any mechanism capable of controlling the Thames must also possess the wisdom to protect itself from those who would abuse such power. The detective moved closer to the edge, his voice carrying that note of absolute certainty Watson had learned to recognize as unshakable conviction. "Attempt to turn that key without proper understanding of the 13th warning, Herr Zimmermann, and you will trigger not a controlled demonstration, but a catastrophic failure that will collapse this entire chamber and seal these passages permanently." The monks built their defenses not merely against Norman invaders, but against anyone who would twist their ingenuity toward malevolent ends. The phosphorescent glow reached crescendo intensity as the ancient stones trembled with mechanical forces stirring to life in the depths below, while somewhere above, the midnight bells of London began their solemn proclamation that the hour of reckoning had finally arrived. Zimmermann stood poised at the threshold of decision, the corroded key trembling in his grasp as he weighed Holmes's words against months of meticulous preparation, knowing that his next action would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of London itself. In the green-lit darkness, Watson could hear the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through distant passages. Lestrade and the Thames River Police, drawn by the mechanical resonance that now filled the ancient chambers with ominous purpose. The confrontation had reached its crucial moment, where medieval wisdom would clash with modern ambition in the phosphorescent depths beneath the Thames. The phosphorescent chamber trembled with mechanical urgency as Zimmermann weighed Holmes's warning against months of meticulous preparation, his mismatched eyes reflecting the eerie green glow while the corroded brass key trembled in his grasp. The German's voice carried forced confidence despite the uncertainty flickering across his sharp features when he declared, "Your medieval superstitions cannot overcome mathematical precision, Mr. Holmes. I have calculated every pressure tolerance, every structural connection in this system." Holmes stepped closer to the water's edge, his characteristic composure masking intense calculation as he withdrew a small brass disc from his waistcoat. "Indeed you have, Herr Zimmermann, but your calculations failed to account for one crucial variable, the possibility that someone might have already prepared for your arrival." The detective's sharp eyes held that gleam Watson recognized as the prelude to devastating revelation. "You see, Professor Blackwood and I have spent these recent days not merely studying the Abbott's engine, but improving upon its medieval wisdom. From his position near the ancient mechanism, Blackwood nodded with evident satisfaction despite his ordeal. The 13th warning operates on principles that transcend mere hydraulic engineering, Holmes. The monks understood that any system capable of controlling London's lifeblood must also judge the worthiness of those who would wield such power. Zimmermann's intellectual arrogance warred with growing doubt as the chamber's acoustics shifted ominously, the water's resonance carrying subtle alterations that spoke to forces stirring beyond mechanical prediction. The approaching footsteps of Lestrade's men echoed through distant passages, their bull's-eye lanterns casting wavering shadows against stones worn smooth by centuries of Thames water. The true genius of the medieval architects, Holmes continued with deadly calm, lay not in creating a weapon, but in designing a guardian that would recognize and neutralize anyone seeking to abuse its power. When I adjusted certain valves in your workshop earlier tonight, Professor Blackwood, I was not merely examining the mechanism, I was preparing it to demonstrate this ancient wisdom. The German made his fatal decision with characteristic arrogance, inserting the corroded key and turning it with sharp determination. The response exceeded even Holmes's expectations, not merely the controlled demonstration Zimmermann had envisioned, but a mechanical symphony as ancient bronze gears engaged hidden pressure release systems throughout the medieval network. The 13th lantern blazed with blinding intensity before extinguishing with finality, while concealed vents opened in the chamber walls, directing the Thames's fury into carefully engineered channels that had waited centuries for this moment. Water cascaded from stone mouths disguised as saints, striking the hydraulic linkage with such force that the remaining lanterns shattered their synchronized pattern. Zimmermann recoiled as his months of preparation transformed into the instrument of his own defeat, the master control mechanism grinding to destructive halt as the medieval failsafe asserted its ancient authority. His subordinates abandoned their positions as the chamber began controlled flooding, not the catastrophic collapse that would threaten London, but the precise neutralization the monks had designed to protect their secrets. Lestrade burst through the side passage with 2 constables, their grappling hooks securing the abandoned skiff as Zimmermann attempted desperate flight toward a narrow culvert. The inspector's shot echoed through the chamber, chipping masonry near the German's shoulder. But their quarry vanished into darkness with the instinct of a cornered rat returning to familiar sewers. Holmes moved to the mechanism with characteristic precision, his brass disc fitting perfectly into the master control where medieval engineering met Victorian preparation. The Abbott's engine was indeed a sermon, Watson, he murmured, timing his adjustments to the subsiding pressure he had engineered, and the 13th warning serves as its moral conclusion. The ancient stones settled into dignified silence as water resumed obedient flow through proper channels, the phosphorescent glow fading to natural darkness, while the mechanical resonance that had filled the chamber with ominous purpose finally ceased. Holmes straightened, offering the corroded key to Blackwood with characteristic courtesy. "London remains secure for another night, Professor," he declared quietly, "though I suspect our German friend will require more permanent discouragement before this matter reaches its true conclusion." In the sudden calm that followed, catastrophe averted, Watson felt that familiar mixture of admiration and relief that invariably accompanied their most perilous cases, knowing that medieval wisdom and modern preparation had combined to protect the city they called home. The ancient chamber settled into dignified silence as Holmes secured the Abbott's engine with methodical precision, his long fingers adjusting the brass valves that would render the medieval mechanism dormant until proper authorities could determine its ultimate disposition. The phosphorescent glow had faded entirely from the stone walls, leaving only their bull's-eye lanterns to illuminate passages that had witnessed centuries of London's hidden history, while the Thames beyond the iron gratings resumed its natural rhythm, no longer churning with mechanical urgency but flowing with the eternal pulse that had carried the city through plague, fire, and countless human ambitions. Lestrade emerged from the narrow culvert with evident frustration, his uniform bearing fresh mud stains and his expression reflecting the professional disappointment of quarry escaped at the crucial moment. Zimmerman vanished into the sewer system like he knew every tunnel and turning, the inspector reported grimly. My men are pursuing, but these passages connect with half of London's underground network. He could surface anywhere from Wapping to Westminster. Holmes nodded with characteristic composure, though Watson detected that subtle tension around his friend's eyes that suggested the detective's mind was already processing implications beyond their immediate victory. Our German friend possesses considerable knowledge of London's subterranean geography. Inspector, knowledge that suggests preparation extending far beyond this single operation. Professor Blackwood approached with evident gratitude, his scholarly features bearing relief despite the ordeal's strain. My dear Holmes, when Zimmerman revealed his true intentions, I realized how completely I had been manipulated. Yet, the medieval architects provided wisdom beyond mere engineering. They understood that any system controlling London's lifeblood must also judge the worthiness of those who would wield such power. Your journal and entries provided the crucial insights. Professor, Holmes replied with characteristic generosity. The modifications you suggested to the hydraulic system proved essential. You created safeguards that served allies while confounding enemies. Watson observed the transformation in their surroundings with fascination as they prepared to ascend, the scientific apparatus in Blackwood's workshop taking on different significance now that its true purpose had been revealed. Then, the 13th warning was not merely a bluff. Holmes. Precisely, Watson. When Professor Blackwood recognized Zimmerman's malevolent intentions, he began systematically re-engineering the Abbott's engine, subtly altering pressure points and recalibrating flow regulators. He knew Zimmerman would follow his research and attempt to use the ancient key, but what our German friend did not know was that the professor had ensured the engine would self-correct, directing water surge not into London's foundations but into overflow channels designed to flood only the immediate chambers. The journey through the concealed workshop felt like emerging from another epoch entirely, and Miss Eleanor Blackwood waited in the study above with barely contained anxiety, her scholarly composure dissolving into tears of relief when her uncle appeared through the hidden entrance, bearing only minor signs of his captivity. Holmes moved to the window overlooking the fog-shrouded street, his sharp profile silhouetted against gaslight as he observed the constables maintaining perimeter watch. Inspector, I suggest we pursue our advantage immediately. Zimmerman's escape represents tactical withdrawal rather than defeat, and men of his determination possess contingency plans for such setbacks. You believe he will attempt another approach? I believe he will retreat to his primary base of operations, the Rotherhithe Chandlery, our drowned informant's invoice revealed. A man does not acquire such intimate knowledge of London's underground without establishing secure headquarters near his area of operations. Holmes withdrew his pocket watch, noting that dawn remained hours distant while their adversary moved through familiar shadows toward what he believed was sanctuary. Watson, we must move swiftly. The fog provides cover, but it serves our quarry as well as ourselves. Lestrade, alert Captain Morrison's Thames River Police to converge on Cherry Gardens stairs. Our German friend believes himself secure in his waterfront stronghold, but tonight London's ancient wisdom shall teach him the final lesson in humility. The fog that had shrouded London throughout their investigation now served as both concealment and adversary as their hansom clattered eastward through streets, transformed into a maze of shifting shadows and gaslight halos. The Thames path wound between warehouses whose industrial chimneys pierced the murk like monuments to modern ambition built upon medieval foundations, while the distinctive odors of tar, hemp, and river mud grew stronger as they approached the Rotherhithe waterfront, where Zimmerman had established his sophisticated base of operations. Captain Morrison's Thames River Police had positioned themselves with military precision along Cherry Garden stairs, their dark uniforms blending seamlessly with warehouse shadows, while their shuttered bull's-eye lanterns awaited Holmes's signal. The detective surveyed the chandlery with that characteristic intensity Watson recognized as complete tactical assessment, noting the reinforced door frames, the absence of legitimate maritime odors, and most tellingly, the faint phosphorescent glow emanating from basement windows that suggested chemical operations far beyond ordinary ship supply. Holmes approached the weathered building with methodical precision, his sharp eyes cataloguing fresh mortar around certain windows and subtle scratches near the lock that confirmed recent fortification against exactly such an approach. "Watson," he murmured, withdrawing the brass disc that had proven crucial throughout their investigation. "Observe how our German friend has prepared for siege. Yet his very preparations reveal the systematic mind that has left us such a clear trail of evidence." The confrontation exceeded even Holmes's expectations for dramatic resolution. The chandlery's interior revealed itself as a command center whose sophistication rivaled the finest military installations. Its walls lined with detailed maps of London's underground network, chemical apparatus for producing phosphorescent compounds, and most ominously, additional brass components that suggested the Abbott's engine represented merely the first phase of a far more ambitious design to hold London's infrastructure hostage through control of its ancient hydraulic defenses. Zimmerman stood beside a window overlooking the Thames, his mismatched eyes reflecting the dawn light that was beginning to penetrate London's perpetual fog. His voice carried the calm authority of a chess master who had anticipated this moment when he addressed Holmes directly. "You have proven more resourceful than my calculations suggested, Mr. Holmes. But tonight's demonstration was merely preliminary. The knowledge exists now, documented and preserved." "Indeed it does," Holmes replied with characteristic composure, "but knowledge without wisdom becomes its own destruction, as the medieval architects understood when they embedded moral philosophy within hydraulic engineering." The detective's explanation unfolded with methodical precision, connecting each clue they had discovered. The mica flakes and petroleum residue in Zimmerman's distinctive boot prints, the river dampness that had betrayed his calling card, the German archaeological correspondence that revealed months of systematic infiltration, and most crucially, the brass components whose modification had transformed the Abbott's engine into a guardian rather than a weapon. The chase that followed utilized the Thames itself as both battlefield and judge. Zimmerman's desperate flight through concealed passages led directly into the tide tunnel, where Captain Morrison's men had positioned nets and grappling hooks with the expertise of those who understood the river's moods. The Germans' superior knowledge of London's subterranean geography proved insufficient against the combined wisdom of medieval engineering and Victorian police work, the ancient stones themselves seeming to conspire against his escape as the turning tide trapped him in passages designed to confound invaders. Holmes stood over the captured adversary with that mixture of satisfaction and philosophical reflection Watson had observed in their most significant cases. "Your error was fundamental, Herr Zimmerman," he declared quietly. "You assumed the 13th lantern marked domination. When it was designed as warning, the monks understood that any system controlling London's lifeblood must also judge the worthiness of those who would wield such power. The systematic dismantling of Zimmerman's operation revealed the full scope of his ambitions, detailed plans for manipulating water levels throughout central London, chemical formulas for underwater illumination, and correspondence suggesting similar operations planned for other European capitals. Yet the ancient safeguards had proven themselves once again, demonstrating that wisdom accumulated over centuries would always triumph over mere cleverness deployed for selfish ends. Professor Blackwood's reunion with his niece provided the emotional resolution their extraordinary adventure required, his scholarly features bearing relief despite the ordeal's strain. The antiquarian's gratitude was evident when he addressed Holmes in the warmth of the Baker Street sitting room, as dawn broke over a London once again secure from those who would exploit its ancient defences. "The Abbot's engine will go to the Board of Works under proper guard," Holmes declared, settling into his familiar chair as Mrs. Hudson provided tea and the morning papers. London's foundations were never meant to answer to any single hand, and tonight has proven that the city's true strength lies not in any mechanism, but in the accumulated wisdom of those who choose service over personal ambition. Watson observed his friend's profile as Holmes took up his violin, the first tentative notes rising like dawn itself, and reflected upon their extraordinary case. The 13 lanterns beneath the Thames had been extinguished, their phosphorescent glow replaced by the natural rhythms of a river that had carried London through plague, fire, and countless human ambitions throughout the centuries. Another case closed, Holmes. Watson ventured as the familiar melodies filled their sitting room with peaceful resolution. "Another lesson learned, Watson," Holmes replied, lowering his bow to glance toward the door, where ordinary London life awaited their attention. "The morning papers will doubtless have gotten everything wrong, but at least we may drink our coffee while it remains hot, secure in the knowledge that some secrets are better left in the depths where wisdom placed them." The fog had lifted entirely now, revealing a city that endured not through any single system of defense, but through the eternal vigilance of those who understood that true security lay in the marriage of ancient wisdom with modern courage, and in the simple truth that London belonged not to any one mind, but to all who would defend it against those who mistook knowledge for wisdom and ambition for justice.